And we are live. Hello, everybody. Good morning. It is a lovely sunny day here in Bavaria. We are at 9 a.m. and 3 a.m. where you are. I have the amazing Sensei Tony here with me, and we're going to talk about all things spiritual. I have written some questions down so that I can try and navigate it a bit. But on the whole, we're just going to have a chat about spirituality, what our personal belief systems are. Hi, Tony. We have another Tony. We've got three Tonys on now. What our belief systems are, how they perhaps interact with one another or come together in some ways, and if there are any differences. Hi, Cynthia. Hi, Jane. I'm going to introduce you with your bio. I'm going to do it properly.
Okay.
I do have to put my old lady glasses on though.
They look good.
And I can say your surname because you have a lovely German sounding surname too.
I do.
Tony Stultz, aka Sensei Tony, is a recognized expert on the practice of mindfulness. He is the founder and director of the Dragonfly Sangha, the Blue Lotus School of Mindfulness Arts. A leader in contemporary spirituality, his works on mindful living have appeared in both popular journals and academic books like Mindful Magazine, Lion's Roar, Buddhadharma, and Engaged Buddhism in the West. He is the author of the award-winning book, Free Your Mind, The Four Directions of an Awakened Life, and his new release, The Three Principles of Oneness, How Embodying the Cosmic Perspective Can Liberate Your Life. They are huge concepts. Hi, Stephanie, good morning. I mean, where do you even start with all of that?
All that before breakfast, right?
Isn't it? You have to give it a second for your mind to actually assimilate to that information before going forth. We spoke the other day and spoke about both our beliefs on spirituality and generally the language. We spoke a lot about the language of spirituality. And I did say that back last year when we did the Big Bang Manifestation Conference, that I came to the realization that spirituality, or the words that we use within the language of spirituality, often differ from one another. But when it comes to the concepts of, like in your book, oneness, it comes a conclusion or just with the verbiage being different. How do you personally see spirituality and obviously the language of spirituality?
Sure. Well, I always try to define my terms. So for me, spiritual is a word that is important to me, and it is something that I think a lot about. You know, what is a spiritual person, that kind of thing. And I think a spiritual person is essentially someone who has allowed themselves to be inspired by the wonders of the universe. So at a very basic level, it's someone who's kind of opened their wisdom eye to see things in a different way.
That's very true. Do you have a specific point in your life or journey that you see as the spark for seeing the world in that wonder?
Yeah, well, when I was a kid, I was always, kind of a strange kid, I guess, because from the time I was very little, and I write about this in my book, when I was about 5 or 6 years old, I had an experience in a little church that my mother took me to. And that experience was sort of, life altering for a 6-year-old. But I remember I after the service was over, I went and they have a thing called a sacristy where the minister has his robes and stuff. And I snuck back in there, and the minister must have burned incense. He was a Methodist, but he wore robes. He was kind of into that thing. And his favorite cartoon was The Wizard of Id. And I remember that. And so I remember being in there and just having this realization that this is what I wanted to do with my life. This is what I felt called to. And at the same time, we lived in New York. I used to sleep outside a lot in the summer, and I was always fascinated with the universe and with the stars. And I can remember, laying outside at night and watching the stars and just, feeling very connected. That's why I say I've always felt very connected. I've never ever in my life felt disconnected. The language, as I grew up, and I was raised Christian and then went into Buddhism when I was fairly young, the language changed, but the experience was the same. And so it was just a matter for me as I grew into adulthood, looking for the language that I thought would make it easiest to convey that spirit.
I think that's very similar to myself, in that the magnificence of the universe was always calling to me on so many different levels, whether that be, like you say, looking at the stars at night, or whether that be with what I saw as a child, because I was very strange, very spiritual as a child, and that whether it be in my bedroom at night where I called upon spirit, or I don't know, there was always that pull, the pull to, whether it be understand or just to fill myself with that magnificence of everything all at once. And I think that for me toppled over into the sciences as well, and my love for the sciences, in that I wanted to understand the world in which we live in, and I want to understand all these big concepts that we have. But also on a personal level, it always brought me back into self. So it always brought me, especially when I thought about like I say, the larger concepts, bringing them back into science, it gave me a language to use with them. And then I have a love for languages as well.
Me too.
German and English are my languages. And I think it was all trying to connect or to understand everything in all those layers that you need within yourself. Experience it as well, or experience it freely. You speak about the concept of true self. And I wondered what your personal concepts of true self are.
Well, before I say that, I would just, connecting with what you were saying, that was the other love for me, was science, and really wanting to know how the world worked. And part of my effort over the last 20 years has been to try to create conversations around that with people on both sides, and unfortunately they see themselves often on one side or another. And, that's a big part of my work or ministry, what I want to say, is trying to help folks realize that, every culture has its story about how things came to be and why we're here and where we're going and things like that. And I look at science as our mythos, that, we're doing the same thing that people have always done. We're just using different language and technology to do that.
the theoretical sciences in particular don't actually differ too much from spiritual concepts.
No, they don't. And I've had the good fortune of, having relationships and conversations with some pretty well-known scientists. And most of them have a very mystical bent. Now, they don't often talk that way, to others. With me, they do, because they feel comfortable sort of expressing that. But the big thing for me is that I think that all people in the beginning, from time immemorial, their how things worked, which is their idea of knowledge or science, was always meshed with why things matter. And I think one of the things that happened in our culture is that became separate, that, we started to look at how things work, and then it seemed to clash at times with why things mattered, the traditions that had other mythos behind them. So that's another part of my effort, is to try to help people to see that those things really should be together, and that there's no reason that someone from a scientific background can't do that. But that's
there is indeed a divide in that. We see even a divide in the spiritual communities on belief systems. That's why I speak about the language or the verbiage that we use within spirituality actually coming very close together. There's a divide in so many ways. I obviously have the World Divination Association as well. And the divination and spirituality don't always come together either. There is it's hard to choose a word without saying the wrong thing. But there's a snobbery sometimes whereby there's a belief system, but another belief system isn't accepted because it doesn't fit within that confines of the box. And snobbery is probably the wrong word for it, but we get so encased in our box that we're not open to the other side.
Right. Well, I think that, it's a human predilection to, when you find something that makes sense to you and somebody brings something else in that you're not familiar with, that the first thing you do is sort of contrast it, and say, well, this is what it isn't. This is, what I am. And I think that's just a human predilection. We do that with everything. But again, I think if someone is spiritual, is someone who is kind of open and listening to, whether we call it the sacred or the divine, and that, what I find is people that I think of as spiritual, there's always an openness to hear or listen to the sacred or the divine from everywhere, so that there's no limitation on how that can come to you. At the same time, I don't think we have to throw everybody together in one mass. No. I think each tradition offers a unique perspective on that spiritual connection, and so I think we can all learn from that, from each other.
I think it's interesting that you say about the way we react to incoming information, because that is very much the self again. And my belief system is in the three selves: the conscious, the subconscious, and the superconscious. And that information coming in is either triggered at conscious or subconscious level, which stops us from then being open to that divineness or oneness at times. And so in effect, our human self steps in and creates a little, I'm not sure about that. How does that assimilate with my views? Or, what kind of triggers can I feel coming in with that.
Well, you asked about the true self. I didn't want to forget that question. So we use, in our practice, we use metaphors, and metaphors for us are unique in that metaphors are not just symbols. Symbols, you will point at something, but sometimes the symbol can become reified and it becomes an idol, so that you're not looking past that symbol anymore. Whereas a metaphor participates in the thing that it points to, so that it becomes iconic, so that you're always drawn into something bigger. So when we use skillful means of language like true self or ego self, we're not doing that in a way that we want to reify that idea, but we want to use it in a pragmatic way to kind of allow our consciousness to get a sense of things. And so you mentioned that the tripartite version that you use, and we use the language of the ego self and the true self. And the ego self for us is the part of us that has gone through various stages of development and is who we are in time and space. And that conditioned aspect of us is designed by, in my teaching, by evolution to try to survive. And in human beings or creatures with big, frontal lobe areas, that became not just about surviving physically, but the survival of status, the survival of those meanings.
The fight or flight.
What's that?
The fight or flight.
Yeah, the fight, flight, or freeze, all that stuff is built into us. And so the ego self, to me, in the way I teach, is not a problem. In fact, it's who we are. But there's another view, which is that we call the true self. And the true self is the metaphor for us that represents the part of us that is connected, that is clear, that is creative, that is compassionate. And that part of us it's a dynamic with the ego self, true self. And so, in some philosophies or some religions, the idea is you want to get rid of your ego. And we think that's impossible, because who's saying that, right? Who's saying I'm going to get rid of you? So you just create a double bind for yourself. But what we do is try to help people to work with the metaphor of the true self and reorient themselves from that perspective, so that they can learn to compassionately care for the ego self. And by loving the ego self and learning to understand it and care for it, and having practices to help it when it gets stuck, our belief is that the ego self then manifests the true self in our life. And that, you can't have one without the other. There's an old Buddhist saying from one of our scriptures called the Heart Sutra, which says that form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Well, for us, that's a way of talking about the relationship of the ego self and true self. You can't have one without the other. And both of those together as a dynamic represent reality. So the true self for us it's an important metaphor, and it's one you'll find, it's very, very old in Buddhism. But again, it's not something, you want to turn into an idol. It's something you want to allow to be boundless.
I think personally it's a key concept in living a spiritual life, is some people call it inner work, others call it work on self, and it is a key concept to knowing oneself's place in the universe, and then being able to be open to the oneness, or whatever word we want to employ in that sentence, being open to the divine or spirituality.
Yeah, well, I think that, I believe personally that everybody at some point in their life has an experience of oneness, and I define that as having a sense of the interconnectedness of everything. And I think people have those experiences. Sometimes they have it during a traumatic experience. Sometimes they'll have it during some peak experience in nature or something like that, or maybe when their child is born. There's all kinds of ways that we have those experiences. But unfortunately, a lot of folks do one of two things that I've found. One is that experience is something that they sort of enshrine as a memory, but it really hasn't penetrated their daily existence, So even though they may have had a big experience, they're still kind of a jerk, They haven't really worked on anything. And the other side of that is that sometimes people will have this kind of experience, this peak experience, and then a sort of elitism comes in where they feel like, okay, I've had it, I've arrived, and now I don't have to do anything. Our approach is that while we recognize those peak experiences can happen and we honor them, what's most important is how you take that fire. And I use that image in my book. When humans first learned to curate fire, it changed everything. And I look at spiritual awakening as an inner fire. But if you don't take that fire home, and keep it, keep the fire alive and really work with it, cook with it, then that experience, unfortunately, it just dies out. So for us, the inner work or the spiritual work of the daily practice is primary.
And I think that's something that really stands out as living a spiritual life versus considering yourself spiritual. Not a lot of people actually know that I am constantly working through myself, my belief system, my connection. It's an all-day event for me, an all-day, all-night event. And I was often labeled as spacey or airy, airhead, not being in the room. And a lot of that is because I am giving thanks, or I am being grateful, or I am doing my version of prayer on a constant basis. And I think that really determines the way that you see spirituality. And I think that's part of the calling as well. I could be wrong, but I think that it's an inner need to experience oneness for the sole reason of being at one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and again, I don't want to sound critical of anyone, because I'm not. And in fact, I think there are certain hallmarks of someone who is spiritually grounded. And the two primary ones for me, besides being curious and open, are, being non-judgmental and cultivating a constant sense of gratitude. And I think if you have those qualities, I don't care what you call yourself, you're living it.
But that is difficult on the human experience. So, if you haven't done the inner work, and even people who have done a great deal of daily spiritual work on themselves, it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of understanding of yourself in order to be at that open level.
Well, I think of it like a relationship, it's like a personal relationship to the sacred, divine, whatever you want to call it. I think it's cultivating a relationship, and like all relationships, it's not just about receiving, it's also about giving. and if we want a relationship to be good, we have to do both. And so for me, I think the first part usually is the reception, but then the second part, or the aspect of our daily practice, is the giving, and giving of ourselves completely to those things. And it's entirely possible. When I've been a chaplain in different settings. So I was a chaplain in prisons. I ran a halfway house for 5 years that I had started. I was a chaplain in trauma centers, in hospitals, in hospice. And the thing that I experienced there was that a lot of people had a religious faith or belief. But when they got into these really bad places, suddenly, those things weren't working anymore. Or more often than not, it always, again, I always great compassion, but when I would step back from it and reflect, I was always sort of mystified at how people would go through some kind of bad experience, and for some reason, then they'd lose their faith, because it just didn't make sense to me to think that, well, people are going through that sort of thing every day, always. And so that's where I saw the crucible to some degree, that if your practice or whatever isn't going to work in the hard times, then it probably was a bit of mental masturbation, and it wasn't really something that you had brought into the warp and woof of your existence. And contrary to that, I did meet lots of people who had beautiful faiths, and even though they were going through terrible experiences, you could see how that belief or that spiritual practice grounded them and helped them to heal and work through that experience. So it was both, but you definitely saw the former. I always felt so bad for them, because they were like, and when you're a chaplain in an interfaith setting, when I was working in a trauma center, we were the go-between between the nurse and the staff and the people. So when someone would come in, and their loved one was dying, or their loved one had died, or whatever, you were kind of the target. You were like stand-in for God. And there would be a lot of things like, why would God let this happen? Or why did that happen? So it was not always fun to be in that position, but I think that work really helped me to clarify what practices that would work, in those tough times, and what practices maybe weren't as significant.
And how do you help somebody who is going through a traumatic time, losing their faith, and because a traumatic time in itself is overwhelming, then to be losing your faith is equally as overwhelming. So what bite-size piece of hope or focus would you give somebody in that situation to not overwhelm?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is, and I train people in our order to be ministers, and a lot of our guys go on to be chaplains in tough settings and things like that. And the thing that I train them in is teach them is that the first thing you want to be in an experience like that is be a compassionate presence. That we all are offering compassion and wisdom, but unless a person really experiences that compassionate presence, then those ego defenses come up. And so there's such power in being a presence. And that when you go into those spaces, you must do it intentionally. My intention always going into a space like that is I want to represent that boundless compassion. And so I see myself as a medium of sorts in that way. And so I don't know what I'm going to do exactly, but I allow the situation to dictate the response. Example I give is one of my first nights on call, I had it was a tragic situation. A guy had accidentally run over his own child. The child had run behind the vehicle. He did not know the child was there. The child had gone out a back door and come around the back of the vehicle. He was saying goodbye to his wife, and he accidentally ran over him, and the child died.
Wow.
And this was one of my first on calls when I was at the trauma center. And I remember being in that, we had a waiting room, a setting room where the doctor would tell them and what had happened. And it's just unimaginable, right? And my own son at that time was only about 3 years old. And, I could see the father. I was watching him because, you watch people and you kind of feel things, right? And I could see he was, obviously the most despondent. And then he got up and he went out of the room. And while I wanted to be there for everyone, I also felt that I needed to follow him. So I did, and I followed him. And I followed him up to the top where the hospital was. They had a landing pad for the helicopters. And, it was a good height. And I knew what he was doing. If I thought in myself in that situation, what would I do? You're so like, this is unreal.
Yeah.
I thought he's going to go up there and he's probably kill himself. And so I followed him up, and I went up onto the roof with him. And I tell this story. I always remember the sound of the gravel on that roof. And he walked over, and I walked over about 10 feet from him, beside him. And I saw him staring over the edge. And again, what do you do? And he knew I was there. He was aware of me at that moment. And I said, I know what you want to do, and I understand it. But is this what you want your son's life to mean? Now, I don't know where those words came from. And you would think it's arrogance, right, to say anything. But that's where you have to go into the situations with intention and to be that and allow that voice to speak through you imperfectly. And, I was overwhelmed with feelings in the situation too. And when I saw that what I said had caused him to pause, he sat down on the edge, and I went over and sat down on the edge, and we wept together. And again, in those circumstances, you don't have to know what to do. In fact, one of our practices is to enter into things not knowing, and then bearing witness to what is there and allowing the healing action to flow out of that. We call that the 3 tenets in our practice. And, and I got to know him in his time. A lot of times you didn't get to see people that much, but I stayed in contact with him. And, he became a part of some kind of legislation that made cameras required in vehicles so that no one would ever do what had happened to him. And that, to me, that's the power of all of that. And so there were no words I could say as to why it happened or all those things, because to me, the why is not the most important. I may not know the why. We may never know the why. Life is mysterious. But the how and the what, we've got a lot of stuff. We've got a lot of sacred traditions that give us the how and the what.
I think the bearing witness is so powerful, and it's something that I've learnt with age more than anything. Is the being there, being present, and witnessing. Do you believe that boundless compassion that you speak of is available to all, or are we each capable of becoming or embodying that boundless compassion?
Yes, I do. I believe that, and I don't believe there's anything we have to do to earn that or try to somehow buy that. I think that is I think One of my teachers, Alfred Bloom, used to talk about how everything is constantly helping us, and he would, and I use it in retreats. I'll say, I want you to do an experiment with me. Let's all take a deep breath, and then I want you to hold it. So that's what we do. And then I don't say anything else. And of course, after about a minute or maybe more for the more advanced swimmer, right? Everybody's like, taking a gasp. And I said, oh, okay. I see. I haven't found one yet. Everybody needs to breathe. And what does that mean? It means that in order to breathe, there has to be oxygen. In order for there has to be oxygen, there has to be trees. In order for there to be trees, there has to be sunshine and light and water. And there has to be a planet that allows oxygen to be. And there has to be a planet that's close enough to the sun, but not too far away to allow that sort of thing to happen. It's a miracle. And when you realize all these things that are constantly holding you up, even though that's a very mundane level of it, I think it opens us up to the awareness that there's a thing like this working in our lives all the time. And I think in our consciousness, that working through comes through in compassion. And when we experience that compassion deeply, and it can be from all sources, we allow the ego self's defenses to drop. And when that happens, that's when I really believe that we can open ourselves to the wisdom. But I don't think we can open ourselves to the wisdom if the compassion isn't there first.
Do you, my mind wandered there onto Ho'oponopono, actually, and the very similar concept that we must be obviously compassionate, but the type of compassion that comes with the not no ego, but the known self, or knowing oneself. How do you reconcile that with social media these days and the whole piling on of information onto ourselves? Because all day, every day, you get notifications, you get emails, you get, it's just so much information all the time. Yeah. How does that work with your belief system and the boundless compassion when you're just constantly at it? This is the best way of putting it.
Well, so we're living in the 21st century, and so we have this technology, and this technology allows us to experience a lot of input that, others may not have had. However, if we go back to like our ancestors that were hunter-gatherers, they were constantly on the alert, because not only were they looking for prey, they were also the prey to a predator. So they were constantly always on the alert and aware of everything in a way that I don't think modern people are. So their whole senses were involved in it, because they had to hunt to survive, and they had to protect themselves from being prey. So I think that there's always been things to get our attention and bombard us daily. And I think our version of it today is just a modern scale. And so I think the same practices probably worked back then that work here. And that is, specifically with social media, the thing that I always say to people is that there's, in my opinion, there's nothing in and of itself that's bad. So it's how you use it. And the question is always, is it using you or are you using it? And so, I'm very clear about how I work with social media. So if I'm going to go on social media and I'm going to look at all the different things that come up in my news feed, right? And the horror over here and the terror over there and all that sort of thing. And we also have to be mature enough in understanding that we're constantly being manipulated by those environments. And that's their goal. Their goal is to get you to click on that or to read that or do that, right? So a long time ago, I used to be a news junkie back, many years ago. And I remember when the first Iraq war came out, CNN had just come out. It was the first time there was a 24-hour news station. And I went through this period where I would read several newspapers, watch CNN, and I was just infused with this. And I noticed that I was not doing well. Like I didn't feel the same sort of sense of harmony. So what came to me is that I decided that number one, I would take a diet and I would only allow myself so much a day, just enough to be informed. And that anytime I read something that, was troubling, I would ask myself three questions. The first question I would ask is there anything that I can personally do about this? Now, in most cases, there isn't. Secondly, is there something about this I can do? And I believe there is. And so I would begin to take those items and, whether you talk about it as prayer in Buddhism, they might call it metta, but I use the word prayer. And I would pray. I would take those things and pray or chant for them. And, people can debate whether that has any effect. But in my mind, if we're all interconnected and everything is a part of this wondrous web, then somehow that energy is going out there. And if nothing else, it changes me.
Yeah.
And it creates a positive relationship to that situation. And then I always make sure that if I'm going to, I always start my day with humor and I end my day with humor. And I think that allows me also to do that. And one of the things that I've done also somewhat consciously is I look for the good news. It's hard to do sometimes, but it's there. Sometimes you just Google it, good news for the day. And you'll find that people are constantly embodying this boundless compassion. And so together, those things for me are how I deal with it. So it doesn't bother me. I don't get weighed down by it. I also don't believe much in the idea of, let's put it this way. I work with a lot of younger people. And a lot of younger people today feel this incredible weight that they have to save the world. Mm. And that if they don't save the world's going to end. And my advice to them is the world is always going to end. And, I remember when I was a kid growing up in a very fundamentalist Christian background, we were always under the idea that the end was coming. And, and then Jesus would come back, but he'd only take those who were saved, and the rest would go through, trial and tribulation, and then there'd be the great war. Good Lord, we were little kids and they made these bad B movies. And on Friday nights, we went to church and watched these movies, and I grew up with that. And I'll never forget coming home from school one day. And I walked down from the school bus and I walked into my house and everything was on. Television was on. Pot on the stove was boiling. Everything was on. The screen door was open, but no one was there. So I started yelling for my mom and my sister. No one answered. I went out in the backyard and looked around. There were toys and stuff. No one around. And I sat back and I thought, oh, crap. I missed it. and as a young, I think I was like 12 or 13.
That's terrible.
Right? No, I did. I thought, oh God, I missed it. I knew exactly why, because I had, like most young boys, taken up masturbation and I had been looking at girly magazines and I thought, oh my God, that's why I missed the boat, man.
That's
Now I need
horrific.
to, right? And it was real. And I went up to my bedroom and I laid down in my bed. And I'm thinking, oh my God, now what? And then something happened to me. And I suddenly thought to myself, well, it's done. Okay, what am I going to do now? I don't have to worry now. And then I hate to say this, and it sounds a little maybe vulgar, but I got my magazines out and masturbated. The hell with it. I'm done. I'm damned. I might as well enjoy it. And it's a true experience. And then of course I found out that one of the kids had gotten hurt, and they'd all taken him off to the hospital, and stuff like that. But that experience changed me, and I realized a lot of things. But I realized that this whole idea of the fear of the end, stuff like that, it's a kind of neurosis, and kids today, are because of the environment, because of the political climates and stuff like that, they're always being told, you got to save the world's going to end, and and I always tell them, look, nobody knows when the world's going to end. It could end tomorrow. Your world could end tomorrow. The whole world could end. And when they ask me, well, what would you do if you knew the end of the world was coming? I say, I'd plant a tree. That's not mine. That's Martin Luther. Martin Luther, accordingly, was asked that one time. But I believe in that. And so what I tell people is that, look, humans are obsessed with the end of the world. And they've always been obsessed with the end of the world. But if you live in that space constantly, all that does is force your ego self to kind of constantly do this. So that's, again, where, I admonish a spiritual practice that transcends the end of the world. And so you don't have to look at it like it's your job, and that doesn't mean you can't be engaged or you can't be active. But I find that when people are engaged in things and they're coming from a truly centered spiritual place, again, there's not anger and hatred. And so that's what I admonish in that kind of situation.
I think you hit upon a real core concept that I live by when, during the story of news followed by home and belief system, that when we truly accept our space in any situation, whether it be news that's coming in, whether it be social media that's coming in, and understand that we are here right now at this minute in time, we are taking responsibility for who we are in that situation. Like the news, you see the bad news, you can either bring yourself into a bad space with that, or you can process it. And I do exactly the same. I pray constantly, morning till night. My word for it is also pray. It may not be the prayers that we have been taught at church, but they are my prayers that I say over and over again. I don't have my beads on now, but I work through that constantly with any kind of social media or any kind of information coming in. I must say that I haven't got to the level of remembering that all the time. I still have moments where I'll see something and comes out.
Sure.
I react sometimes when I'm not proud of reacting, but I do try and remember me in all equations and bring it back to here, right now, who I am, and taking responsibility for my part in any part of the universe, any part of connectedness, saying, yes, I'm playing a part in it too. And then for me, that's where the understanding and the compassion comes in for me personally, because I do remember that. So I think for me, this concept of boundless compassion is something that I need to still work on. And as, like I say, information comes in, I pray to, it's not reconnect, but it is bring myself back into me.
Yeah, well, I mean, you hit on something very important there, which is we have to be careful not to turn our spiritual practice into another quest for perfection. And that's one of the things in our approach. We teach that perfection is an illusion. It's not something real, and that it's always the carrot or the stick, you know. And unfortunately, people can turn the spiritual life into another quest for perfection. They're always trying to be something else. And, you know, whenever you're always trying to be something else, you immediately are running up against self-acceptance. You're running up against compassion, because it accepts you just as you are. You don't have to do anything to prove your existence or justify it. Not in our teachings. In our teachings, one of the manifestations of meditation for us is the practice of just being and recognizing that grace that comes just from our being. We don't have to do anything. And if you can see that, then you don't worry about getting hooked, you know? So if I'm watching something, like you said, and I get hooked by it, I got hooked by it. It doesn't penetrate, though, you know, and you learn to do two things: not let things penetrate the heart or go to your head. And you just sort of accept them as being human. So when I get hooked by something in our practice, I can just sit with it and accept it. And then the other practice I can do is something that we do. Our system of mindfulness is called the 4 directions. We have a practice in that called the 4 questions. And if I really get hooked by something, then I can sit down and do that practice. Or I can sit with someone else who knows it and they can do it with me. And I always find at the end of that process, which might only take a half an hour, that not only am I clear and do I feel that sense of connection again, but there's always an action I can take. There's always some kind of action I can take based on that experience, so that I have a formula I call it: insight plus experimental action equals realization. That if you don't act on it, even if you have the insight, if you don't take some action, you don't really realize it, and it hasn't quite penetrated. But yeah, I see that in people all the time. They come into a spiritual practice and then they just take all the ego stuff and put it into that. And it's the same game, only now it's even harder, because, you know, how can you challenge something when someone says you must be loving, you must be compassionate, you know?
That's very cool.
We're all human. Let's start there.
Well, that's what it all comes back to, isn't it? We are all human.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing.
Spiritual life.
And I think the spiritual path is not so much about trying to find it outside of the human or mundane, but it's about finding it within the very marrow of daily existence, the ordinary. And one of my favorite poets is William Blake, and his famous poem about to see, you know, in heaven in a wildflower, you know. That to me is that spiritual eye. You know, we call it the wisdom eye that you open up. You know, you see things differently. You see things differently. In our 3 Principles of Oneness, which are the kind of foundational teachings from the Buddhist tradition, and I've kind of reimagined them a little bit for today. But you know, when you see suffering, you recognize that suffering begets compassion. And that's magical. It doesn't have to exist, but it does. It's real. And likewise, you work with change differently. When change comes into your life, which is always doing, you learn to see change as an opportunity rather than an enemy. And that you realize that's how the universe works, that nothing new can come into being without change. Whether it's, stellar stars that are born because another system has died, or it's the, supernova in our own lives, And then the third principle is to realize that this limited sense of self, this idea that we're just this frightened little ego alone in this cold universe, that's a delusion. And that once we see how everything is interconnected, we realize we're the same. And then, whatever practice that we find that does that for us, that's how we awaken and reawaken ourselves every day.
And that is the perfect way to end the hour.
It was a lot of fun. I could do this. Perfect. We could do this for a long time. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
And you are joining us with the World Spiritual Association launch party next Saturday and Sunday, 20th and 21st of March. Your details are below. AskSenseiTony.com. Your books and everything are on your website. And hopefully we'll be doing more together.
I would love that, Tony. I appreciate the opportunity. And I'm looking forward to it.
We will see each other again.
All right.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. Check out the details below on everything on AskSenseiTony.com. Also have a look at worldspiritualassociation.com and sign up for the launch party on the 20th, 21st of March. It's free, and there's so much amazing spiritual things to learn on that weekend. So much giving back to the community. And I'll see you on the next one.
Thank you for putting all that together.
Bye-bye.
Bye.